FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
We're back. You're listening to the Financial Survival Network. This is Kerry Lutz. With us now is Darryl R. Schoon. You know him well. He wrote that paper in 2007 predicting the financial collapse. He was right on the money. Now we're talking about the next wave. You know, it's all about what's next, what's going to happen next. Obviously, gold and silver, you know you have to have that, but what can we look forward to? You know, the existing order, financial order, economic system, that's going bye-bye. What's going to take its place? Where is that going to leave you and your family, your mortgage payments, your credit card debt, all that great stuff? Darryl, welcome back. So what's going on here?
Good to be here, Kerry. You know, while you were leading that intro, a metaphor came to me that we're all surfing on a sea of change. All right? Mm-hmm. And the change is bigger than we've been used to. All right? And we all are surfing on it. But the truth of the matter is, we are here surfing on a tsunami. Okay? On a true tsunami. And one of the reasons I say this is that there was a book written by a guy named David Hackett Fisher in 1996, and it was called The Great Wave. And he talked about price revolutions. Fisher was an economic historian. And the book is fascinating because it said that what we're going through now, we've gone through before. Not exactly, but he says life is not linear. And history doesn't necessarily repeat itself. As somebody said, it doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. All right? Fisher went back as an economic historian, and he pointed out that throughout history, we've had these periods of relative prosperity and stability. And these periods last between 120, 200 years or whatever. Okay? Maybe 150. Somewhere in that range. And we've given them names, like the Middle Ages. Okay, and then he said the next age was the Renaissance. And they last for the same period. They're all relatively stable, and prices are stable. That's what he says. Prices are stable. That's one of the indications. It's like a thermometer. And then after the Renaissance, you had the Age of Enlightenment. For another period of like so many years, prices were stable and society was stable. And then the period that came after it was what he called the period of Victorian stability. I call it the period of banking, all right? Because I think it underlies what this present epoch is all about. And that's why the issues of gold and silver are so important, all right? Because it goes to the fundament of this present state that we're in, temporarily present state that he called the age of Victorian stability. Now, in Fisher's book, he said each one of these ages is interrupted by a like period of between 80 and 160 years of what he calls rising waves. Prices. Rising waves. Okay, he called these price revolutions. All right? So as an economic historian, he correlated these disruptive periods between ages as indicated by rising prices, which culminate each time in the complete economic and cultural collapse of the existing society. All right? I mean, after the Middle Ages were stable and everything was copacetic for whatever period of time, prices started rising, said Fisher, until they culminated in the collapse of that era, the Middle Ages, the feudal era. And when it collapsed in total destruction of what had been there before, he said it gave rise eventually to the era that we know as the Renaissance. So in other words, we went out of the Dark Ages, and which was succeeded by the period of the Renaissance, which was an extraordinary different era of flowering of culture, thought, painting, arts, and whatever. Well, what history usually leaves out is the transition. And this is what Fisher was focusing on. He called these price revolutions. And he says these transitions, these price revolutions happen between every major epoch. And not only are they characterized by rising prices, which culminate in out-of-control inflation, et cetera, and the collapse of the then economic system, but they are often accompanied by catastrophic catastrophes, all right, which are different. Between the era of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, that particular price revolution was characterized by the Black Plague, all right? And in his book, he had pictures of where the Black Plague hit in Europe and where it crossed and came back, all right? And then he talked, and in another era, I think it was between the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment, there was what he called the 100 Years' War. Total warfare, virtually, just laid waste Europe, and finally was resolved itself when that society collapsed, the Age of Enlightenment, which he said was an age of free thinking. I mean, the Renaissance, it was arts and culture and stuff, but you couldn't think because the Catholic Church ran it. All right? I mean, if you didn't think like them, you were out of the game. All right? You couldn't play. And then you had that succeeding price revolution of total disruption. And that resolved itself into the Age of Enlightenment, where people could think differently than the Catholic Church. Not easily, but they still could. All right? And then it was interrupted by another period of chaos, economic, civil, and social. And that resolved itself ultimately into what Fisher called the Age of Victorian Enlightenment. All right? Victorian stability. So when I read this book, I was stunned because I like history, and I'd never seen it in such a way. And I was very particularly interested in what Fisher said was going on today. And Fisher said the age of Victorian stability ended, or it sort of came to an end but it's sort of like a cusp. It doesn't end until it's over. But the intervening chaos that's going to bring it to an end, what he called it was the price revolution. These periods of between periods of stability that bring each epoch to a close. This present great wave, that's what I call the book, The Great Wave, started in 1896. Right? And Fisher said these intervening periods of increasing chaos and instability take between 80 and 160 years. Now, I think we're almost 120 years into it. All right? So we're sort of getting old in the tooth in this intervening period of chaos. And Fisher's book sort of was looking at this also looked at this present period. And in the first half of it, the chaos was, I would say, basically exemplified by war. In the first half of the 20th century, more people were killed by war on the planet than ever before. The World War I and World War II laid waste 160 to 107 million people. All right? Now, when we came out of that, Fisher said it didn't start another era. The collapse of the world geography of nations after World War II and the reordering of the world after World War II was a blip in the great wave that we're going through. It didn't mean that a new era was going to come out. Fisher said no. The great wave was still progressing. It just hit a change in even the progression. And so what happened is the world came back together. And this time, the economic world wasn't driven by England, but the same system, the same economic system of debt-based money was now centered in the United States. And the United States took over England's role. Now, England had the good part, all right? It had the stable part. When the United States took it over in the mid-20th century, it was only an interruption in the great wave of extreme chaos that was going to bring the period of Victorian stability to an end. And so what happened is the same system that created it, which was debt-based money, allowing England to go to war on credit, allowing England to enforce its will over the rest of the world into what is called imperialism, and ultimately put us on the same page, all right, was taken up by the United States in a latter phase, a phase that was going to bring the complete destruction of what had gone on before. And so we, in 2014, looking back at, and Kerry, especially with us in the gold and silver deal, see that 20 years into this, the United States goes off the gold standard, takes gold out of the monetary system. Now, gold was like a cotter pin holding the central banking system of credit and debt together. That's really what it was. But the saying that had come up in England, even before capitalism, was that bad money drives out good, was true. Because what happened is, even though when England allowed the Bank of England to issue debt-based money alongside the gold and silver coins issued by the Treasury, by the king, eventually the paper money drove out all the gold and silver out of circulation. All right? And so it did. And that process accelerated when the United States did it. When the United States came into power, in great power in the mid-20th century, we had 21,775 tons of gold. No country ever in the history of the world had ever that much monetary gold in their treasury. Genghis Khan, nobody. Maybe the Catholic Church, but they ain't sane. And so what happens is that we have all this gold. 20 years later, we go off the gold standard. And it wasn't because we convened this great convocation and decided that gold was indeed, as Keynes said, a barbarous relic. No. We decided, and it was Nixon who did it, and Friedman said, listen, if we we're out of gold. Basically, that was the reason. It was necessity. Our gold supplies had depleted so fast because we had this military worldwide presence, and all this money was coming back into the United States for redemption from all these countries. And we had promised to redeem. We anchored the gold system at $32 an ounce per ounce of gold for U.S. dollars. And so, because we had spent so much overseas, our gold supplies were just diminished. And in fact, the United States has never had a public audit of its gold since 1953-54. So we don't know how much gold is there. It's like a woman, not many. Yeah. And in fact, by my own rough calculations, when I wrote my book, I figured out that we were probably 50,000 tons of gold in the hole when we shut the gold window. All right? Because we couldn't cover. That's all there was to it. We couldn't cover. All right? Military spending, worldwide military spending from the U.S. was accelerating. They had already enough dollars floating around to empty their treasury, and whatever else we had left outstanding was going to send us into bankruptcy. So rather than have that happen, Nixon shut the gold window out of necessity. Inflation started exploding. It just took off. All right? And ultimately, they had to call in Paul Volcker back to the Fed from the Treasury, where he was there on the watch when they shut the gold window. In fact, John Exter, he had asked John Exter, one of the central bankers. Exter was like a saint compared to all the rest of them in it. All right? But his sainthood was because he saw the truth. Exter told him. All right? Exter told him. He was brilliant. And he'd been vice president of Citi. He was vice president of the New York Fed when I saw the gold going down. And in Gold Wars, Ferdinand Lipps's story, that Swiss banker about Gold Wars, he said Exter told him that Volcker walked in the room in 1970, and said, what are we going to do? And he looked at Exter, and Exter said, well, Paul, he said, I think we ought to, we should reevaluate gold, put the gold price higher. And Volcker looked at him, and he said, well, I can't do that. Politically, it's impossible. And then Exter looked at it. He said, well, if you don't do that, Paul, you're going to have to shut the gold window. And 2 weeks later, they did. All right? When Volcker shut the gold window, Exter took all his money and transferred it into gold. Now, at that time, U.S. citizens couldn't own gold, all right, in bullion form, all right? But he bought gold-based, gold coins, everything. Put everything into gold, and he retired. He ended. He was, in his 50s at the time, early 50s, and he retired. Why? Because he knew gold was going to explode. And so Exter put his entire personal assets into gold at $32 an ounce in the early 1970s. All right? And it exploded. And Exter said at that time, he said he knew that inflation was going to happen. And in an interview in the 1980s, he said, listen, when somebody asked him about what they saw that was going to happen, he said, someday Americans are going to wake up and their real estate, they're not going to be able to sell it because the prices have gone into a bubble and collapsed. All right? He says, this is really tragic. He says, I'm older. All right, and I'm not sure if I'm going to live to see this, but it's coming as sure as tomorrow is coming. He said this in 1980. Exeter died in 1996. All right, and I talked to his daughter, and his daughter called me up because I was one of the people who sort of found him. I mean, you see that Exeter's inverse pyramid, floating around. Well, I found it, and there was only one person who had it, and it was a guy named Franklin Saunders. All right, and he's got a little newspaper called The Moneylender, and I asked Franklin for permission to post it. All right, and he told me about Exeter. He knew Exeter. All right, and so I started talking about it, and Exeter's daughter called me up a couple years ago and said, she wanted to thank me for her father becoming known for who he was, and she said that it's really too bad that her father didn't see that what he said was coming true. And I told her, I said, your father didn't need to. He knew it was going to happen. He knew it with a certainty that a deflationary collapse was going to happen. All right. Now, when you ask where we are now, I say that's exactly that. In my book in 2007, Time of the Vulture, How to Profit from the Crisis, I wrote that a deflationary collapse was along the way. And finally, 6 years after the crisis happened in 2008, you're seeing the word deflation mentioned, finally being mentioned. And in my book, I said it's the word that central bankers don't want to talk about because it's like because they never had a solution for it, never. I mean, Friedman had a bogus solution, and Friedman's student Bernanke used that bogus solution, which was to open up the floodgates of credit, to expand the money supply. All right. Keynes's thing was, well, when the shit hits the fan, you got to spend more to take care of the people who are drowning, which is true. All right, that's one reaction. But he's on the left, and on the right, Friedman had another reaction. He said, no, just open up, just print more money, basically. All right, sure. Because there's a contraction of the money supply, and that'll work. Well, Bernanke got to it, and he said, great, and he got his chance. He exploded the money supply as best he could, and when he lowered interest rates down to almost zero, which wasn't enough, he started buying $1 for dollar assets to hopefully revive demand.
Hey, by the way, Darryl, did you hear that the world's central banks now own somewhere around $29 trillion worth of stocks?
And the Japanese are going after it nuts.
How good is that?
Okay, now that's dollar for dollar buying. Okay, I want to say something about that, Kerry. That's interesting, all right? Because the banking system is built on leverage, all right? The central bank sits at the core, all right? And they've got all these banks in their systems, okay? Now, when those banks ask for credit, which to print money, the central bank allows them, based on the reserves they have, to print 10 to 15 times as much, issue 10 to 15 times as much credit, not money, but credit in the form of loans based upon the savings, quote unquote savings in their banks. Okay, banks' assets are in two areas. One is their own assets. All right, in other words, shareholder assets. Okay, what the bank owns theoretically, and then you have this other category which is different than that, and it's called your savings deposits. All right, from savers. Now, what banks do is they take in savings from people. All right. And they're allowed by the central banks to immediately issue 10 to 15 times as much of those savings in loans. All right? So you've got a leveraged edifice. All right? And then they get to charge now whatever they want on those loans. In other words, they take in savings and they pay what now? 2, 3, 4%, depends what it is. And they are able immediately to issue 10 to 15 times as much as that aggregate amount of savings at an interest rate which ranges now from we're in real estate at 4%, 4.5%. All right, but basically your credit cards you're paying anywhere between 12, 16 to 35. All right, commercial lines of credit, that is unused credit but still sitting there tapped. All this thing, 10 to 15 times as much as the savings they have, and this is where they make their money. They have a huge amount of money. All right,
it's all about the leverage.
A huge amount of money. Now, what happens is this is the Ponzi scheme of banking. Excuse me for that phone going off. There's a Ponzi scheme of banking, okay? And not a Ponzi. In other words, they've lent out far more than is there, allowed by the central banking system. This is what the Bank of England did truly in 1694. This is how England went to war. This is how England took over the whole world because they could print money and nobody else had, and they had the power to back it up. All right? So you've got this highly leveraged system. Now, what happens when the system slows down? What happens when the system, instead of slowing down, contracts? When the system slows down, that means the economic activity slows down. That means the constantly compounding 12 to 35% debts, they can't get paid. Because unless the system expands to a degree to pay down constantly expanding debt, it'll collapse. In other words, if you imagine a bicycle, Kerry, the front wheel is credit, the back wheel is debt, all right? And the front wheel always has to stay in front of the back wheel or the bicycle will flip over, okay? Now, what is driving that back wheel? The back wheel in the banking system where capitalism operates, which is another word for banking, all right? Because there's a word where capital, debt-based capitalism, has been substituted for savings-based capital, which used to be gold and silver, all right? So that back wheel constantly compounds day and night, all right? And it gets bigger and bigger because the more ground the front wheel covers, the back wheel gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, the front wheel has to expand at least at the same rate as the back wheel, or the back wheel is going to go faster than the front wheel, and the whole bicycle is going to collapse. All right?
Sure.
Now, what's happening is the front wheel is slowing down. All right? When the economy's slow, the front wheel slows down, and the central bankers get nervous. I mean, they're the Wizard of Oz. The rest of us, we're on that front wheel trying to make a living, trying to pay the kids, trying to go to college, trying to take that trip to Hawaii, trying to do whatever we can with their debt-based money. All right? And we're on the front wheel. Well, the bankers know it's a bicycle. We don't know it's a fucking bicycle. We have no idea it's a bicycle. All right? That it's like a juggling act. All right? And the bankers are looking, the central bankers are looking at that back wheel and go, holy smokes, front wheel's slowing down, back wheel's still going faster and faster. We've got to do something. So they lower the credit to us in the front wheel. All right? But in a certain time, and usually that works. It's like usually that works because it makes the front wheel go fast. But when you have a huge speculative bubble collapse, it doesn't work. It didn't work in the 1930s when the stock market collapsed and took everybody's savings and the banks went down. All right? The bicycle fell over. In fact, if Hitler hadn't come along, wasted the rest of the world, all right, it just destroyed every existing country out there, or at least reshaped it, all right? And the United States didn't have all that pot of gold, we couldn't have started again. We couldn't have started the Ponzi scheme again. The pieces wouldn't have been there. What you had after the end of World War II was huge global demand and a huge stash of gold in a central bank.
And on that note, when we come back, let's talk about where we're heading, where we are now on the Financial Survival Network.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next.
When your accountant wants tax-free income, this is what he does. Accountants know the law. They also know that any American could legally get paid up to 3 times per month, 100% tax-free. That's 36 tax-free checks each year. It doesn't matter what you make already. This simple strategy could work for anyone. Go to www.irsrevenge2.com to learn how. That's irsrevenge2.com.
The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
We're back on the Financial Survival Network. We're talking with Darryl R. Schoon. So, Darryl, where are we heading right now? I mean, this thing is a mess. It's spinning out of control.
Yes.
Janet Yellen, whatever you say about her, how much confidence can you have in this lady here? You have to think that Bernanke got out at just the right time, huh?
Let me listen. These guys are smart, all right? Greenspan loved being called maestro, all right? Mm-hmm. And he was, and of all the people there, Greenspan, of course, he believed in the system that had an end game. He didn't believe it had an end game, all right? But he was so politically weak that he gave in to Wall Street's demands for cheaper and cheaper credit, which would allow Wall Street to leverage more and more and more, all right? Greenspan saw it was going to blow up. His gift, his parting gift to America wasn't unended prosperity. His parting gift was the housing bubble, which he set in motion inadvertently, trying to resurrect the U.S. economy after his cheap credit blew it up with the dot-com bubble in 2000. All right? He saw it coming. So in 2006, he hands over the reins of the Fed to Ben Bernanke. And in 2007, this ain't just coincidence, that's when the housing bubble started to unravel. So he got out of Dodge right while the getting was good. All he lost was his reputation, and it means a lot to Greenspan, all right? But, he can lick his wounds. He had a good run. So Bernanke comes in at 2006, takes over the reins. It starts collapsing in 2007, 2008, and he gets the chance to put in place Friedman's solution to the collapse, which he'd been learning in school. I mean, he told everyone, I'm a student of the Great Depression, all right? And in fact, at Friedman's birthday party in 2001, Bernanke got up and made an apology to Milton and said, listen, I want to apologize on behalf of all central bankers that we screwed up. We caused the Great Depression by tightening the money supply. And because of you, a depression will never happen again. So Bernanke, full of vim and vigor, gets into his thing. He's up to the task because he's got a playbook. All right. And he slashes interest rates down to 0.25%. And that doesn't do it in 2008. So in 2009, he starts QE. That's when he started. That's when that figure you just came up with, that central banks own $29 billion.
Trillion.
Jesus Christ. Trillion. God damn it. Seems worse. Trillion worth of stocks. That's when they started. They didn't do that before. Why? Because that meant they had to go to their own balance sheets. Their balance sheets. The central bank's balance sheets go into the red. Usually they leveraged everybody else. That figure that you gave me, Kerry, shows more than anything that the danger we're in. All right? That the boys at the top, the Wizard of Oz, had to reach into his own pockets to keep the game going. All right? That shows the red. So when you say where we are now, I say is this. The Wizard of Oz is now tapping his own reserves to keep the Ponzi scheme going. All right? That the bankers benefit at more than anybody else. All right? And we are in what I've said for years. I've called the end game. Now the end, what we see as a recovery is not a recovery at all. It's a protracted collapse. All right? And in this period, David Hackett Fisher said, in every period of intervening price revolutions that bring the present culture, economic society to a complete collapse, to make way for a better one, ultimately that comes out of it, is that in that last stage, prices start rising upward and led by food and fuel. Now, everybody listening to this today, I want you to know that the Fed has taken food and fuel out of the CPI. Why? Because it's volatile. No, they say it's volatile. Well, they just want to distort the thermometer. But everybody listening to this knows that what they paid for a gallon of milk, a pound of hamburger, a rack of ribs, and a gallon of gas, and the utility bills was a heck of a lot cheaper last year than the year before. And let me tell you, it's going to be more expensive next year than it is now. We are, each of us, on a surfboard, on a tsunami that is going to take out this present world that we live in, just as that tsunami took out those villages in Thailand and killed 250,000 people. This is what we're headed for. And the key of the present system is paper money. And that's why when I wrote my book in 2007, and I first started out as a paper. When I wrote that paper in 2007, gold was around $650. And I said that we're headed for collapse. Gold is going to double, triple, quadruple. And it has, almost. It almost quadrupled. It certainly tripled at that time, virtually tripled. Hitting 1900 in a couple years ago, before the central bank cartels moved quickly to shove down the price of gold. Because their greatest fear is that investors will run to gold as not only as a haven of safety, but as a chance to get rich. When you've got both greed and fear fueling an asset class, it's through the roof. All right? Usually people go to gold out of fear. But when people got going to gold out of fear and greed, because they saw what happened in 1980.
There's no stopping it.
There's no stopping it. The rise in the price of gold, Kerry, in the 1980s was, in a 10-year period of time, was 2,400%. All right? The rise in the stock market, the greatest rise in the history of the stock market, we're not even there in nominal terms, even though we're high. For inflation-adjusted terms, we're still below its 2000 high. The 18-year rise went from a low of 777, 1982, to 2000, and that was a rise of only 1,700, a rise of significantly 1,700% over 18 years. All right? Now, most everybody has their money in paper assets. That's why they remember stocks as with a great deal of more love than they do gold, because they weren't there for the rise of gold. All right? A few were, okay, in the 1970s when it went from $32 to $850 in 8 years, in only 8 years, okay? So that's why we're going to do it again. Now, for those who are in gold and silver already and bought at 1,600, 1,700, 1,800, if you can, my thing is don't sell, all right? Because it's going to explode even further. We are in the last stage of the last game. We are in the battle to the death, and we're just bit parts. We just happen to be here at this time. I don't know if "happen" is the right word, but we certainly are here at this time. But we're bit players in a much bigger drama that's being played out. All right, the greatest source of wealth and power in the last 250 years has been this debt-based money issued by central banks. All right, and it's made a lot of people really stinking rich. All right, we in the United States were lucky because we were here when the big game basically been flattened after World War II, and we in the United States experienced the greatest rise. All right, that's over. Just like China's immense shift from a basically feudal system into a manufacturing powerhouse happened in around 25 years, and now it's over. Now it's topped. All right, and it too is a bubble. And when bubbles collapse, the bigger they are, the worse the fall. Now, we also are in a bubble, all right? And we didn't even know it. We just thought it was because of our hard work. And I'm not saying you didn't work hard. I'm not saying you didn't do overtime, and I didn't say you didn't save. But the truth of the matter, most Americans made their wealth during the credit run-up between 1982 and today. And most of it was made in between 82 and 2000 when the stock market went. The explosion of the stock market was a result of Greenspan's easy credit. All right? That's what it was. And so we flowed on that easy credit. Kids went to school. I went to school. We bought cars. Life was good. Life was good. All right? Oh, yeah. But as David Hackett Fisher points out, we are but bit players on a much bigger stage. And our lifespan of 60, 80 years, sometimes less, sometimes more, is when you lay it back against David Hackett Fisher's longer lifespans of these periods of relative stability and intervening equal eras of collapse, which they don't name. I mean, you notice, Kerry, that the era of the Middle Ages, of the Renaissance, of the Age of Enlightenment, and the Age of Victorian Stability, or what I call the Age of Banking, we also have sort of terms for, all right? But we don't have terms for those equally long periods of eras that destroy the existing periods. Why? Because we don't like to think about it.
Don't want to remember them.
We don't want to remember.
We want to put them out of our collective minds as far as we can, right?
Yeah. In fact, Kerry, you know the word recession? The word recession never came into being until the Depression in 1930s, because every expansion and contraction phase, it went expansion, depression, all right? And that was just the way it was. But depression was sort of all right because people didn't have a lot of money, it was tight, but it was replaced by a new word in the 1930s, recession. After that talked about milder depression because we didn't want to talk about the depression anymore. Because what happened in the 1930s put a blot on the contraction phase of the bankers' Ponzi scheme that was so bad we shoved it out of our mind. Only now is the word deflation coming back into, you see it. Oh, Europe's deflating. And we're not even calling it deflation. We're calling it low inflation.
And we haven't even gotten there yet either.
And we haven't even gotten there. And in my book, in
wait till prices are 50% less. Then we'll know what deflation
then we'll
is.
know it's there. It's when excess credit created so much excess supply that when demand collapses, when the credit bubble collapses, that you've got so much supply, no money's flowing around, that prices drop because suppliers are trying to find buyers. We're not even there yet. And I wrote this in my paper in 2007. I said deflation is the elephant in the room. Well, it ain't in the room yet. But I tell you, that rumbling outside on the porch, I mean, it's there. And closing your eyes is going to do no more good than in the early 1980s of refusing to have an AIDS test and you're gay. You know?
Will it cause the price of gold to go down, though, in nominal terms?
Not in the end. In the end, when people talk about the price of gold, I say this, in the end, how high is it going to go? I say, you know what? In the end game, which we've never been to before, when paper money goes to basically worthlessness,
it's intrinsic value.
It's intrinsic. It's gonna say it may be $1 billion an ounce, because if our paper currency goes to what the Weimar Republic's Reichsmark did, it won't even be measurable in terms that we know today.
Or the Zimbabwe dollar.
Or the Zimbabwe dollar. Or the Hungarian florin after World War II.
Yeah.
All right?
Go down the list.
It's going to go down the list. It's all there. And so where we're going to get to, what I'm saying is that we are all on a surfboard. And for those who are lucky enough to have gold and silver inside their little fiberglass surfboard and are able to hold on to their surfboard long enough for the surfboard to come back up, they will have as much as you can have when this process resolves itself. It is going to be a humdinger. David Hackett Fisher wrote in 1996, talking about the Great Wave that started in 1896. He said the amplitude of change in this great wave is bigger than in any great wave he measured. By any metrics, he measured all the intervening great waves from the Middle Ages on. So we are here in the mother of great waves. We are here at a time when change is happening that we can't even conceive of. And just as much as you couldn't conceive of the Renaissance when you were in the Middle Ages, you couldn't conceive in the Renaissance of people thinking outside the box of the Catholic Church. And then you couldn't conceive of the immense wealth that was going to be created by credit in the age of Victorian. As this era, our present age of credit and debt collapses, we can't even imagine what the next era is going to be like. But what we know is this: the collapse is going to be worse. And the era, if all preceding eras have been true, it's going to be a much better era, but in terms that we can't even conceive. We can't even conceive of it. So rather than even speculate on it, I mean, speculation right now is confined to basically 90% of how we can preserve the present era. All right? Why? Because we're all attached to it. Slave owner and slave alike does not want the present era to end. Even though there are far more slaves than slave owners, even the slaves want the relative stability and the once created wealth where we at least ate 3 meals a day, all right, and could borrow a house and borrow the money in a house, borrow a car, you know, and live on the fringes of what the slave owners have.
Even if the ignition switch in that car might tend to get you in an accident. Get you killed, but at least you could get it.
At least you can get it. At least you can go from here and there, you know. And so I understand why people want to go back to what was. What I'm saying is, it ain't coming back, friends. We are sitting, it's beyond redemption. Putting gold back in the system isn't going to work. Bitcoins are not going to substitute. All this stuff is rearranging the deck chairs as the ship is going down. I mean, this is the big one. There ain't no coming back. Those lifeboats that are being anchored over the side have gold and silver in them, and there ain't even be that many. What it will allow you to do is to float back up and deal with what's going to happen. And the person who wrote the best thing on that was to my mind, was Dmitry Orlov. He was a Russian engineer who lived in Russia when the empire collapsed, and he saw it collapse. And he got out of Russia. He's an engineering student. He comes to the United States, gets a job here, and then he looked around the United States and goes, holy smokes, it's going to happen here. And he wrote a paper called The 5 Stages of Collapse. And he said, first thing you're going to see is the retail thing go down. And
that's
because
happening.
It's happening. They're resisting it, but all the big chains are going out. All right. What happened to Blockbuster, which happened not because of the economic collapse, it only exacerbated it, is going to happen to to Best Buy, Lowe's, Home Depot. Okay, all these big boxes. That we have more retail space than any other culture on the planet. They're going to go out. And then he says, then after you're going to see the collapse of your supply chain, all right, you're going to see the collapse of your economic chain, all right, the banks are going to go out, all right, and then after that, you're going to see the collapse of your governments going out. They're going to go down, all right. I mean, as odious as you think Russia is today, he saw it go from from the communist Soviet with a heavy hand to at least Putin or Gorbachev. All right? I mean, it's better than it was. All right? Mm-hmm. Everything is incremental. It's dependent on your point of view. And he said, the United States is going to go down like that. And Bucky Fuller said that too. Bucky Fuller said in his last book in 1981, he's the greatest futurist the America ever had. He said, the bankruptcy of the United States is going to lead to the bankruptcy of all other countries. And finally, I think we're going to get to that crazy song that George Lennon sang, Imagine. Imagine a world without borders, without countries, without fear.
John Lennon, yeah.
John Lennon. And it's going to be a rough ride. And we can bitch about it. We can blame people. We can do whatever we want. But that's all just, wasting time in this era. I think that's necessary is that once you relocated your assets, you've done all you can. All the rest is details. Okay? And I've always said, and in every article I've written, buy silver, buy gold, have faith. And the faith, I said in my book in my paper in 2007, is the hardest to come by. But if you've got any, you got to get it while the getting's still good. All right? But what I want to say is this. Faith, in my own personal life, I have found is built in the trenches. Faith doesn't come to you when you could just when your back is covered. Faith comes to you when you're pushed off the cliff. When you are faced with either going further into fear or going into that most improbable areas of faith, that there's something bigger than you that is out there. This going off the cliff economically is akin to an alcoholic spinning out of control. All right? When only then do you really reach out. The rest of the time it's sort of a societal palliative. It's like you're in the club. All right? And this is the club, if you're in the Middle East, is composed of Muslims. This is the club, if you're in the South, is composed of born-again Christians. All right? This is the club that if you're born in England is composed of Episcopalians, that. And now it's also a club of sort of non-believers, people just floating around. We don't really have a grasp on anything bigger in ourselves because this age of credit has allowed us to become so materialistic that all the stories about anything bigger than us are an illusion. And in fact, I think that at least in the New Age, when it broke down, the ideas of Don Juan, the ideas that Carlos Castaneda brought in, the ideas of that ancient cultures at least have a shred that the Hopis may know more about really what's going on in a way that we do, all right, is the few ways that it's getting through the cracks. But until this thing that we have shatters, we're not going to go to it again. Because one of my metaphors about where we're in, Kerry, is this. That change, that we're at the most materialistic culture that we've ever been. In the past, at least the myths were somewhat in touch with us. All right, our social cultural myths that we call religion are in touch with. And in truth, in everything, people who wanted power got a hold of it and tried to manipulate us. All right,
oh, sure.
I mean, they all did. I mean, you get a little
Always.
power, people start listening to you. Somehow, you have the truth. You start telling that person what he ought to do with his life. Because he's looking for your answers, and God knows.
All about control.
All of that control. And it's, what is that saying? There was a saying that said, if you want to see a man's character, it was a French guy who said this, it isn't money when you see his character, it's power. Mm-hmm. All right? And in the olden days, and that's why I understand atheists. I understand atheists because they've grown up in a world where the people who talk about the greater source, God being or the universe, distort it so they're sitting there driving around and have all the power. Mm-hmm. And they have everybody listening to them. All right? I understand why they've just walked away. But to me, it's like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. All right? But that doesn't mean going back into the old church. That means going back into your life and looking for something. It's there. If you want to find it, it'll come. All right? In your own way, on your own path. And your atheistic beliefs may be a part and parcel of it. Other people find their higher power when they become alcoholics, junkies. All right? And I see people walking around who've gone through 12 steps much more centered than other people who've only, who haven't been pushed to such extremes. But in the collective sense, humanity is going to go into the same off the edge that the 12-step people in their own personal lives have. And on that way down, we're either going to find a way out or we're going to go to the bottom. That pendulum of change is either going to be just a pendulum going from materialism to an all-inclusive better world that is coming. And I believe that. I always said that this collapse is only a step to a better world. And people didn't want to hear, when I wrote it, one, they didn't want to hear about a collapse. And two, they didn't believe in a fucking better world. All right? I mean, that's what it was like in 2007. Now, people say, okay, there's a collapse, but we've sort of arrested it because they're scared of anything worse. I'm saying, no, it ain't over. It ain't over. People are telling you it's a recovery, and everybody wants to believe it. And the way I understand why you want to believe that it's recovering. Because nobody wants the patient to die.
That's silly because it's just not reality. Let's face it.
The patient is still in intensive care.
Forget it.
They haven't even moved him to the recovery room. They're telling you he's in recovery.
They still got the paddles on him.
Next house.
Yeah, they still got the paddles on him. And he's smoking.
No, it's where we are. But it doesn't change anything.
No.
It doesn't change anything.
Not
so
in the least.
So on that note of hope, Kerry, there you are. A better world is coming. But I tell you, we've got a few years in front of us to get there.
Got a lot of fun ahead.
That's
for sure.
That's it.
Got a lot of fun ahead. And Darryl, just tell us your website, where to find you, and read your missives.
They can find me. My missives are at my website. It's news every day. I update it. All the bad news you can take on medication. All right. And it's www.Schoon. That doesn't stand for doctor. Those are my initials. SCHOON.com. And you can also find me. I have a YouTube channel called Schoonworks. SCHOONWRKS. And that's where you find my videos. So between those two, if you're looking for more, it's there.
All right. And we got the links on the financialsurvivalnetwork.com. And make sure you subscribe to the newsletter. Darryl, we will talk with you real soon. You be well.
You too, Kerry.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.